As the preceding discussion of Suhail Khan's recent exploits on behalf of the Islamist cause suggests, the effort Grover Norquist has sponsored and enabled to penetrate and subvert the right continues to this day. Some, particularly among Norquist's admirers for his work on tax issues, might be inclined to dismiss what he did a decade ago as an aberration or at least ancient history. Unfortunately, that is not the case. The next part of this course offers some illustrative examples of the myriad ways in which Norquist and his team are still very actively and purposefully promoting the Islamist agenda with considerable and toxic effect.
3 areas of Grover Norquist's activities on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists warrant particular scrutiny. First, there's the contribution he continues to make to building and utilizing infrastructure that can complement and enhance the effectiveness of the Islamists' own ground game, particularly with respect to its influence operations against the right. Second, we'll examine Grover Norquist's efforts on behalf of recruiting, credentialing, and trying to elect as Republicans candidates with Islamist ties. Finally, we'll consider a few examples of the current and ongoing help he is rendering that is intended to advance Islamist agenda items and that is having, to varying degrees, a corrosive effect on the right and a subversive effect on the national security. Grover Norquist is nothing if not a formidable political operative. Since 1994, when he founded Americans for Tax Reform, Norquist has understood the importance of building infrastructure, both for fundraising purposes and to give the appearance, if not the reality, of political muscle behind his initiatives. We've already been introduced in previous parts of this course to 4 of the organizations Norquist has established and/or exploited for such purposes, namely Americans for Tax Reform, or ATR, the Islamic Institute, or II, the Wednesday morning meetings of the so-called Center-Right Coalition, and the Conservative Inclusion Coalition. Now let's look at what Norquist and his team have been doing lately with each of these. The mothership of the Norquist influence empire is his first organization, Americans for Tax Reform. As we've discussed, ATR's offices, meetings, and networking facilities have been indispensable to his efforts on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists. For example, since at least June 2010, Norquist has used ATR and his authority as the keeper of the No New Taxes pledge to promote a priority for the Islamists, and, for that matter, other enemies of the United States, namely, eviscerating America's defense capabilities. Norquist misleadingly testified before the Simpson-Bowles Debt Reduction Commission that defense expenditures, which, as a percentage of gross domestic product are a fraction of Cold War levels, actually exceed them. He called on the panel to make sure that Pentagon spending was on the table for reductions. Especially since the 2010 elections, ATR has repeatedly pressed legislators in general and, in particular, those elected with the support of the Tea Party, to reduce defense spending. Within days of those elections, the ATR website was once again promoting Norquist's Simpson-Bowles playbook, including his call for cutting national security expenditures. They also insisted that the GOP, quote, reject the sanctimonious pardoning of Department of Defense waste, unquote, refused to give, quote, defense spending protected status, unquote, and not ignore, quote, the burden military spending places on the taxpayers, unquote. In an accompanying press release, Norquist implied the test of whether legislators are serious about curbing government spending will be their votes to cut defense, and if they fail to measure up, quote, they will not be asked to stick around, unquote. The next year, as Congress was deliberating the annual Defense Appropriations Bill in September 2011, Grover Norquist enlisted the heads of 3 other anti-tax organizations in a joint letter to committee chairmen. The authors declared that, quote, the country cannot afford to continue wasteful spending in its most important endeavor, the nation's security, when a lean and efficient defense is more necessary than ever, unquote. Later in 2011, ATR circulated for conservative signatures yet another draft anti-defense letter. This one was apparently shelved, however, after two distinguished retired military officers, four-star Admiral James Ace Lyons and Lieutenant General Jerry Boykin, joined me in writing the signatories of the previous two missives. We urged them to consider three highly relevant facts before lending their name to another of Norquist's missives. First, the Defense Department had already taken massive cuts, a detail not noted in the draft letter. Second, they were being positioned to the left of President Obama and Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta on further reductions in national security outlays. And third, they may not want to follow guidance on such matters from someone like Grover Norquist, who has been publicly identified as working with Islamist enemies of the United States. We've previously had much to say about Norquist's Islamic Free Market Institute. What was once described by the New Republic as, quote, a nerve center for Muslim lobbying in Washington, unquote, seems, however, to have been shuttered after 2006. At least, that is the last year for which its foundation filed a 990 with the IRS. That said, at least one of its principals, the last chairman of the Islamic Institute's board of directors, Suhail Khan, is still active in several of Grover Norquist's other entities. For example, Khan regularly attends and frequently contributes to the proceedings of Norquist's Wednesday meetings. In May 2011, Suhail Khan participated in an ambush Grover Norquist arranged at the Wednesday meeting for then GOP presidential candidate Herman Cain. Khan and a couple of other Norquist associates took Cain to task over several statements he'd made on the campaign trail about creeping Sharia and efforts to insinuate it into the United States and its government. Such concerns prompted Herman Cain to say quite sensibly that he would not appoint Sharia-adherent Muslims to his cabinet or the judiciary. After all, they could not be, in his words, quote, totally dedicated to this country and our Constitution, unquote. The candidate was absolutely correct. He should have been applauded for his grasp of the threat posed by Sharia and its stealth jihadists, and for his courage in speaking forthrightly about them. It was a travesty that a meeting of the so-called center-right coalition would have been used by Grover Norquist's cohorts to excoriate him for holding and expressing such views.
Shortly after this episode, I had an opportunity to provide Herman Cain with a short briefing on Grover Norquist's ties to the Islamists. He thanked me and told me I'd helped explain something he couldn't figure out. The then candidate said that after the ambush during his appearance at the Wednesday meeting, Grover Norquist had walked him to the elevator. According to Mr. Cain, Norquist used the occasion to, quote, defend Sharia law, unquote. 2 months later, a former Norquist staffer, then on Cain's campaign, arranged to take the candidate to one of the most Islamist mosques in the Washington area, the All Dulles Area Muslim Society Center in Sterling, Virginia. Recall that the Adams Center's imam is Mohammed Majid, the president of the largest Muslim Brotherhood front in the country, the Islamic Society of North America. Majid was among the brothers Suhail Khan took on his interfaith dialogue mission to Auschwitz earlier in 2011, which resulted in Majid's prominent placement at President Obama's second major Muslim outreach speech in May 2011. Khan was among those who claimed, after Cain's visit to the Adams Center, that the candidate had apologized for and recanted his previous statements about Sharia. In fact, Herman Cain afterwards issued a statement making clear that, while he meant to give no offense to peaceable, law-abiding Muslim Americans, he remained dead set against Sharia. Quote, while I stand by my opposition to the interference of Sharia law into the American legal system, I remain humble and contrite for any statements I've made that might have caused offense to Muslim Americans and their friends. I am truly sorry for any comments that may have betrayed my commitment to the U.S. Constitution and the freedom of religion guaranteed by it. Muslims, like all Americans, have the right to practice their faith freely and peacefully, unquote. Suhail Khan's distortion of Herman Cain's views further attests to the sort of taqiyya in which that influence operator engages. Another example of the use of the Wednesday meeting on behalf of the Islamists' agenda suggests that the same can be said of Khan's enabler, Grover Norquist.
In July, Norquist arranged an improbable group vilification of state-level legislation that should enjoy the wholehearted support of true conservatives and others on the right. This episode warrants a detailed drill down. The legislative initiative is known as American Laws for American Courts, or ALEC. ALEC addresses a problem we discussed in Part 2 of this course, namely the insinuation of Sharia into American courts. As we've seen, this is an important part of the civilization jihadists' efforts to legitimate and institutionalize that totalitarian doctrine in this country. ALEC would make it more difficult for state courts to apply any foreign laws, including but not limited to Sharia, at the expense of constitutional civil liberties and state public policy. Assuring the supremacy of the Constitution and American laws in our courts has been made necessary because, as we've seen elsewhere in this briefing, the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists have extensively made common cause with the American left to advance their shared agenda of weakening and fundamentally transforming this country. A particularly ominous aspect of this part of the Red-Green Coalition's program has been the insistence that U.S. courts must employ transnational law to improve our own Constitution and statutes in adjudicating disputes. Unfortunately, this initiative now enjoys strong support within the U.S. government, notably from Harold Koh. Koh is the top international lawyer in the Obama administration, and he has been an aggressive promoter of transnational law for decades. In his previous capacity as dean of the Yale Law School, Koh approvingly identified 4 and sometimes 5 justices as members of what he called the Supreme Court's transnationalist faction. Rulings by jurists like these throughout the U.S. judicial system have allowed foreign laws, including Sharia, to encroach on American ones. In November 2010, Oklahoma voters were asked whether they wanted to prohibit the use of such laws, and specifically Sharia, in state courts. 70% of them approved an amendment to bar that practice. Predictably, because the Oklahoma language explicitly focused on Sharia, federal judges have enjoined its application at the behest of a Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas front, the Oklahoma franchise of the Council on American-Islamic Relations. ALEC avoids this pitfall by applying its prohibition to any foreign laws that do not uphold constitutional civil liberties and state public policy. To be sure, because of its anti-constitutional character, Sharia would be among the foreign laws that would be disallowed under ALEC. But by not mentioning Sharia specifically, ALEC denies its opponents the legal basis for their objection to the Oklahoma Amendment. 3 states have already enacted American laws for American courts: Tennessee, Louisiana, and Arizona. Legislators in some 20 other states have introduced versions of ALEC. Wherever it has been taken up, public awareness has been heightened about the nature of Sharia and the stealthy efforts to bring it to America. So has the determination of citizens and their representatives to do whatever they can to keep their state Sharia-free. Not surprisingly, preventing the further progress of American laws for American courts has become an urgent priority for the Islamists and their allies. So, at his Wednesday meeting in July, Grover Norquist brought in several presenters to denounce American laws for American courts. They trotted out the Brotherhood's unfounded but oft-repeated claim that this law would preclude Christians and Jews from practicing their faiths. In reality, ALEC would not even prevent Muslims from practicing Sharia. It would simply disallow Sharia's use in court, and there, only where doing so, would impinge on American freedoms. Then on September 26th, Norquist brought to his center-right coalition meeting 2 representatives of one of the most leftist organizations in the country, the American Civil Liberties Union. It's not clear why he thought the non-Islamists among those present would find such authorities persuasive to a roomful made up of people and organizations that consistently oppose the ACLU. They were all treated, nonetheless, to the ACLU's characterization of American laws for American courts as unconstitutional, Islamophobic, and unacceptable legislation. Fortunately, true conservatives and millions of other Americans all over the country know better. As we've also seen, the Conservative Inclusion Coalition is another vehicle being used by Grover Norquist and Suhail Khan for their Islamist influence operations.
What I have a problem with is they say, jihad is their way, martyrdom is their goal. I mean, that is antithetic to everything the Constitution says.
I understand all of those things.
You got your answers. So.
No, I understand all of those.
Do you agree with that too, Mr. Khan?
With what?
That we should be outreaching to the Muslim Brotherhood and
well, the Nation of Islam.
Muslim Brotherhood in the United States.
There's no Muslim Brotherhood in the United States.
No.
To recap what we learned in Part 4 concerning the coalition, it has been used to promote Khan's taqiyya, that there is no Muslim Brotherhood in America. Its members have publicly called for Islamists of Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam and Reconquistas of La Raza to be included as conservatives. As we'll discuss at the end of this part of the briefing, such a gambit is a classic influence operation technique aimed at destroying the right from within. We've also seen how Suhail Khan, whose day job is working for Bill Gates's notoriously anti-Republican Microsoft Corporation, has been representing himself as the Republican National Committee's liaison for outside organizations and interests. While that's evidently not the case, his coalition has been permitted to use the RNC headquarters for its meetings with, and influence operations aimed at, congressional staffers and others on the right. Grover Norquist has created at least 2 other entities that he uses for his Islamist influence operations. The first of these are what might be described as franchises of his center-right coalition meetings in Washington. Nearly every state has a regular meeting modeled after Norquist's Wednesday gatherings of conservative activists, lobbyists, politicians, and their staffs. Some are more closely affiliated with Norquist than others, but ATR representatives are typically regular participants. Depending on the state, Norquist himself sometimes attends, with particular regularity at New York City's Monday meeting. An indication of the use made of these local groups can be seen from an item previously posted on the website of Muslims for America, or MFA. As we've discussed, this is the Muslim group that Suhail Khan and Grover Norquist have brought into the Conservative Political Action Conference, despite claims by the MFA's founders that Republicans are racists and bigots. In this now concealed posting, one of those founders, Simi Gul Hassan, describes how Norquist's Americans for Tax Reform is using its nationwide network to promote and gain political entree for Muslim leaders. Remember that phrase, quote, creating relations with top political leaders, unquote, as we will see it at work shortly.
I want to give you a bit of background on another organization created by Grover Norquist to promote agendas that are divisive to the right and helpful to the Islamists, the American Conservative Defense Alliance. As we discussed in Part 3 of this course, in 1999, soon after our Center for Security Policy began subleasing office space from Norquist's Americans for Tax Reform, I discovered that the Islamic Free Market Institute was a front for Islamist influence operations.
I sought the counsel of a conservative leader and mentor of mine, Paul Weyrich. Paul was a patriot who believed strongly in Ronald Reagan's philosophy of peace through strength and national security as a central pillar of the right. Paul Weyrich was as troubled as I was about the Muslim Brotherhood's penetration of the conservative movement and urged me to brief conservatives and other Americans about the danger it posed to the right and to the nation. For his part, Paul undertook to help in countering this threat, and he did. For the moment, let me just tell you what Paul Weyrich, who passed away in 2008, said on the subject, publicly. In June 2003, the Wall Street Journal reported in a front-page article that Paul Weyrich characterized Norquist's dealings with Muslims as, quote, very dangerous, unquote. He added, quote, we have to acknowledge we're at war, and that it's very possible some of the Muslims want to establish a fifth column in this country, unquote.
My own concerns were like Paul Weyrich's, and they only grew as I witnessed from 1999 to early 2003 what Grover Norquist and his Muslim brothers were doing at the Wednesday meetings held in the conference room we shared on L Street in Washington. As one of the few regular attendees with a background in national security, I was more sensitive, perhaps, than others to repeated efforts by Norquist and the Islamists to mainstream their operatives and agenda items. I did what I could to call them on it. For example, I pointed out at one meeting, shortly after 9/11, that President Bush was meeting with representatives of Abdurrahman al-Amudi's American Muslim Council, presumably unaware of its Muslim Brotherhood connections, let alone that the AMC was encouraging Muslims on its website not to cooperate with the FBI.
This warning was part of a campaign the Brotherhood was mounting at the time. It declared, quote, the FBI is looking for information to use against you, your family, and or your community. The FBI has a history of harassing and harming minority and immigrant communities. Some people are spending a long time in jail because they or their friends talked to the FBI, unquote. Norquist jumped out of his chair and rushed across the conference room to consult with Abdul Wahab al-Kebsi. Al-Kebsi had worked with Abdurrahman al-Amudi and Khalid Safuri at the American Muslim Council and the American Task Force on Bosnia. At the time, he was serving as Safuri's deputy at the Islamic Institute.
Norquist returned to the table and whispered to me that there was no such posting on the AMC website. I checked next door with my colleagues who confirmed that the item had been removed just before, following the publication by me of a column in the Washington Times calling out the American Muslim Council. My colleagues provided me, however, with a screen capture of the AMC site from the day before, which showed, sure enough, the offensive item. After I left the meeting, Norquist knowingly lied to the group, telling them that what I had said was wrong about the website. Over time, it obviously became more and more problematic for Norquist's influence operations to have me in the Wednesday meeting. Finally, he seized upon an appearance by me at CPAC in January 2003 to evict me from his weekly meeting.
Shortly before my appearance on a panel at the 2003 Conservative Political Action Conference, another indication of the Muslim Brotherhood's successful penetration of the George W. Bush administration came to my attention in the form of a January 17th press release from Abdurrahman al-Amudi's American Muslim Council. The AMC thanked one Ali Tulba for getting representatives of the AMC and other Muslim Brotherhood fronts, such as CARE, into the White House to meet with senior administration officials.
So who was this Ali Tulba? It turns out he was another Norquist protege who once headed the Washington office of Young Republicans. Interestingly, his father had served as treasurer of a large Muslim Brotherhood complex in Texas, the Islamic Society of Greater Houston, which is made up of 29 mosques and related schools.
At the time of the AMC visit, and indeed for most of 2001 to 2005, Ali Tulba was the associate director in the Office of Cabinet Affairs. According to his biography, Tulba was responsible in that capacity for coordinating the activities of some of the most sensitive agencies of the United States government, including the State, Defense, and Justice Departments. He also claims to have served as President Bush's liaison to the Arab and Muslim American communities, a role that came open once Suhail Khan left the building. Tulba's bio also says he, quote, performed a broad advisory role on public diplomacy efforts to the Muslim world, unquote.
At CPAC, I observed that the challenge in wartime of striking the correct balance between privacy rights on the one hand and national security on the other was made more complicated by the presence in our country of Islamist organizations adept at exploiting our civil liberties and institutions. In particular, I warned that some such groups, notably Al-Amoudi's American Muslim Council and the Council on American Islamic Relations, were conducting a worrisome political influence operation against the Bush administration.
I also mentioned that the AMC and CAIR had thanked Ali Tulba for giving them access to senior officials. I speculated that his perspective on these matters might have been influenced by an unsettling connection. His father's ties to the Sharia-adherent Islamic Society of Greater Houston, which suggests that Tulba may have been accustomed to being in the company of pro-Islamists at home.
The following Wednesday, Grover Norquist burst uninvited into my office, brandishing an open letter, citing my remarks at CPAC as evidence of, quote, racism and bigotry, unquote, that have, quote, no place in the conservative movement, unquote, or in the Wednesday meetings held in the conference room we shared. I responded with a lengthy open letter of my own, describing my concerns about the role Norquist and his Islamic Institute had been playing in enabling and facilitating Islamist political influence activities aimed at the Bush administration and other Republicans. I urged him to cease and desist, lest he do real damage not only to the president and the party, but to the nation's security. Which brings us to yet another of Grover Norquist's institutional vehicles for Islamist influence operations. Not content with banishing me from his meetings, Grover Norquist began exploring ways to counter the Center for Security Policy's role as a leading conservative voice on national security matters. Initially, Norquist seemed intent on promoting another organization called Frontiers of Freedom, founded by a hawkish, conservative former U.S. Senator, the late Malcolm Wallop of Wyoming. In the process, Norquist clearly hoped to counter any damage to his conservative bona fides by arranging for Wallop's group to give him its first annual Ronald Reagan Award in November 2003. As the honorary committee for the event included Jack Abramoff and other Norquist-tied Washington movers and shakers, Norquist apparently was able to assure the organization that his friends would help secure the financial success of the event. By 2007, Grover Norquist evidently thought it would be better to have what amounts to an in-house organization to promote views on national security that are billed as conservative, but bear no resemblance to those of, say, Ronald Reagan or William F. Buckley, Jr. In fact, as we shall see momentarily, they correlate much more closely with the libertarian, neo-isolationist policies of Representative Ron Paul, spurned by the overwhelming majority of Republicans in the 2008 and 2012 election cycles.
For that matter, the policy predilections of his American Conservative Defense Alliance, or ACTA, seem frequently to track with those of the red-green, leftist Islamist coalitions. Norquist has several connections to the American Conservative Defense Alliance. For instance, according to ACTA's archived website for 2009-2010, the organization was housed in the Americans for Tax Reform suites at two different addresses, the one we had shared on L Street and, after Americans for Tax Reform relocated to 12th Street Northwest, in the ATR suite there as well. What is more, Grover Norquist's wife, Sama, is listed as a member of the ACTA Board of Directors and as the organization's corporate secretary. Among its initiatives inimical to the Reagan-esque philosophy of peace through strength, the Norquists' American Conservative Defense Alliance played a founding role in yet another leftist Islamist red-green united front, the Campaign for a New American Policy on Iran, or SNAPI. As we shall see, the company the Norquists' anti-defense organization is keeping is instructive on two counts. First, It shows yet again his readiness to make common cause with some of the right's worst political adversaries to the detriment of the national security. Second, it suggests that Grover Norquist's sympathy for the Islamist cause transcends the Sunni-Shiite split that is supposed to prevent those like the Muslim Brotherhood and al-Qaeda from working with the Iranian regime. In fact, this is but one indication that differences of Islamist theology can be set aside in the interest of advancing their shared Sharia agenda. By June 2008, SNAPI is said to have had, in addition to the American Conservative Defense Alliance, over 40 other partner groups. Among the most notable was the National Iranian American Council, or NIAC, a group the Tehran regime's own press has described as, quote, the Iran lobby, unquote, in the United States. Another SNAPI member is the Open Society Policy Center, an instrument George Soros uses to advance his post-American agenda. SNAPI also includes the Institute for Policy Studies, a radical leftist organization that gained notoriety during the Cold War for its reflexive sympathy for and advocacy of Soviet positions and initiatives. Even the Muslim Brotherhood front known as the Council on American-Islamic Relations is a member of SNAPI. CAIR's involvement underscores yet again the point I made a moment ago. Sunni Islamists are perfectly capable of collaborating with Shiite ones in their shared goal of promoting Sharia and weakening impediments to its triumph, most especially in the United States. Being a SNAPI partner organization also shows the true colors of J Street, an ostensibly mainline Jewish organization that is actually consistently anti-Israel. That should come as no surprise, since J Street is underwritten by a man who strongly shares that attitude, billionaire philanthropist George Soros. The founding meeting of this pro-Iran campaign was convened in the Americans for Tax Reform conference room in November 2007. According to minutes made public in the course of a libel lawsuit filed by Trita Parsi and his National Iranian American Council, ACTA also hosted another important meeting at the start of 2009 to map a shared plan of action for influence operations aimed at the new 111th Congress and President Barack Obama's administration. Iran lobbyist Trita Parsi emphasized in a June 2007 email the importance he attached to Norquist's involvement in SNAPI's work program. It read in part, quote, Grover Norquist offered his support, but did not sign on. He exemplifies not just a powerful voice in the Republican Party, but an important figure that can provide transpartisan legitimacy to our efforts. I think it is critical that we do whatever can be done to get him to sign on, especially since his full involvement would give our efforts a tremendous credibility boost. Unquote. According to the January 2009 SNAPI meetings minutes, the group's legislative strategy for the new Congress would seek to, quote, end as we know it, unquote, a fund U.S. legislators had created to help empower democracy advocates in Iran. Since shutting down the Democracy Fund had long been a goal for the mullahs and their agents in America, they must have been extremely heartened by the buy-in to this initiative of Norquist's team. Another important agenda item for SNAPI involved providing cover for the Obama administration as it refused months of requests by millions of Iranians for assistance in liberating their country from the oppression of the mullahocracy. By contrast, as we have seen, President Obama called for the removal of President Hosni Mubarak within days of demonstrators taking to the streets in Egypt. SNAPI also helped the Obama administration deflect criticism for its reluctance to agree to meaningful sanctions on the Iranian regime, and SNAPI enthusiastically favored, as did the Iranian regime, Barack Obama's ill-advised pre-election pledge to pursue unconditional negotiations with Tehran. These policies helped buy critical time for the mullahs in Tehran to realize their nuclear weapons ambitions. In addition, SNAPI insistently campaigned against any U.S. or other military measures that would have kept one of the world's most dangerous nations from getting the world's most dangerous weapons. In the next part of this course, we'll consider how Grover Norquist has sought to translate the relationships he has been building
between the American rights leaders and his Islamist friends into still greater political clout for the civilization jihadists.